The heat pressed down on the small Texas town like a heavy blanket, the kind that clings to skin and makes every movement feel slow, deliberate. Asphalt shimmered under the sun, storefronts rattled with old fans working overtime, and people drifted lazily between shops, arms full of groceries or trinkets from the weekend market. Then came the scream. It tore through the street like glass shattering, cutting off conversations, halting footsteps. Heads turned. A girl, barely 15, lay pressed against the pavement near a police cruiser, her dark hair stuck to her damp forehead. A uniformed officer straddled her, his knee driving into her back. One of his hands clamped her wrist, twisting it at an angle that looked wrong even to untrained eyes. "Stop resisting," he barked, his voice sharp, brittle. She wasn't resisting, she was crying, her voice cracking with each plea. "Please, I didn't do anything." The officer's jaw was set hard. He was a broad man in his 40s, with mirrored sunglasses that reflected the crowd beginning to form around them. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, but the authority in his stance was darker, heavy, suffocating, swollen with certainty. He demanded she show ID, and when she said she didn't have it, something in him turned. His words slid from procedure to insult. Sharp little blades. "You people are all the same," he muttered, loud enough for those nearest to hear. A ripple went through the bystanders. Parents pulled their children closer, not out of safety, but shame. They didn't want young eyes watching this. A man in a baseball cap pulled out his phone, angling for a clear shot. Others froze, paralyzed between conscience and fear of consequence. Then came the sound. A dry, sickening crack as the officer forced her arm further, far past compliance. The girl's scream pitched into a raw, unfiltered note of pain. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Someone shouted, "Hey! Enough!" But no one stepped forward. The air itself seemed to stall, as though the sun above had stopped burning for a second. The officer looked up briefly, lips curled into a smirk. "This is what happens when you don't follow orders," he said, projecting his voice so everyone could hear. His tone carried not instruction, but humiliation, like the girl was a lesson he was proud to teach in public. Phones came out in clusters now. Screens lit up, little blue rectangles floating in shaking hands. The moment was no longer private, it was becoming evidence. Yet even as the cameras rolled, no one moved closer. Fear held them where they stood, fear of the badge, fear of what stepping in might cost. The girl choked on her sobs. Sweat and dust streaked her face, and her voice dropped low, barely audible except to the man pressing her down. "My grandfather won't let this go," she whispered through clenched teeth. The officer sneered, leaning closer, as if savoring the words. "And who the hell is your grandfather supposed to be?" He twisted harder. Another cry, another ripple through the crowd. People flinched as though their own bones had been bent. Somewhere near the back, a child asked his mother, "Why is he hurting her?" The mother didn't answer. She pulled the boy behind her and stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, mouth locked tight. The smell of asphalt mixed with sweat, and the metallic edge of panic hung in the air. What had begun as an ordinary summer afternoon was shifting into something else entirely. No one could yet name it, but the tension had a direction. It was moving, gathering, about to tip. The officer glanced around at the circle of faces, daring them silently to intervene. His hand tightened again on the girl's wrist. The sound that followed was soft, but unmistakable. The faint, dry pop of something giving way inside her arm. She screamed, higher, sharper than before. And that was the moment when the crowd froze completely. Not a breath, not a shuffle, not a cough. Just the heavy stillness of dozens of people realizing they were witnesses, not participants, bound together in a silence thick with complicity. A teenager near the front whispered, "Somebody has to stop this." But the words hung unanswered, swallowed by the heat and fear. And in that silence, between the officer's grin and the girl's sobs, between the phone's recording and the stares locked in disbelief, one figure stood stiller than the rest. A man, broad-shouldered, in a simple short-sleeved shirt, his face half hidden by the brim of an old cap. He hadn't moved when the scream first tore the air, hadn't lifted his phone when others did. His arms remained at his sides, but his eyes were locked on the scene, unblinking. Most people didn't notice him yet. Their attention was riveted on the violence in front of them. But in a few seconds, the weight of his presence would shift the entire street, because that man was Chuck Norris. And the officer had no idea who he just challenged. Just wondering, "Where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow." The officer adjusted his grip on the girl's wrist, scanning the crowd like a man daring anyone to interfere. "Back up," he barked. "All of you. I'm the law here." His tone wasn't for her anymore. It was for the dozens of witnesses, for the lenses pointed at him. He wanted to own the moment, to stamp his authority into every recording. But instead of retreating, the crowd pressed closer. Their voices rose in uneven bursts. "Let her go! You've done enough! She's just a kid!" The street no longer sounded like a marketplace, but like a jury, every voice colliding with the next. Phones lifted higher. A woman in a red dress shouted, "You're on camera!" A teenager yelled, "We're posting this now!" The officer's jaw flexed. For the first time, the certainty in his posture faltered. And then the still man from the back of the crowd moved. He stepped through the ring of onlookers, not fast, not slow, just deliberate, each footfall cutting through the swell of voices. A simple shirt tucked into faded jeans, sleeves rolled up against the heat. No badge, no title, no microphone. Yet, as he approached, a hush fell in his wake, the way sound dims when a storm rolls over a plain. Chuck Norris didn't look at the phones. He didn't look at the officer's mirrored sunglasses or the badge gleaming in the sun. His eyes rested on the girl first, on the twisted angle of her arm, the panic in her breathing. Then, finally, he shifted his gaze upward. The officer squinted at him, irritation blooming. "Move along, old man," he snapped. "This is police business." And the dam broke. It started with a single voice near the front, someone recognizing him. "Chuck!" A wave of gasps, then a ripple of voices calling his name. "It's him!" "Chuck Norris!" Applause erupted, clashing with whistles and jeers aimed at the officer. The crowd, already volatile, now surged like water against a dam. Half shouted in admiration, half demanded action. The officer stiffened. His grip on the girl tightened. He leaned forward, using volume to smother his unease. "Back off!" I said, "back off! I'm the law here!" Chuck's answer was not a shout. His voice cut low, steady, pitched just enough to ride the silence that had spread through the nearest ring of spectators. "The law," he said, "is to protect, not to break." It wasn't a line rehearsed for cameras. It wasn't barked or laced with bravado. It was quiet, stripped bare. And precisely because it was quiet, it carried. The words threaded through the shouts, found the microphones, pierced the static of live recordings. The officer blinked, as if the sentence had unsettled something in him. But pride overrode hesitation. He straightened, still holding the girl pinned, and sneered, "You think you're somebody here? These people don't need your lectures." Yet the crowd's roar told another story. They chanted Chuck's name now, voices stacking on voices, a vibration that made the windows of nearby shops tremble. Some clapped rhythmically, others booed the officer, but all of it fed the same fire. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was theater, tribunal, history in the making. The girl whimpered, her voice drowned under the din. Chuck glanced back at the swelling circle of faces, then down again at the officer. His shoulders never shifted, his stance remained loose, but his presence pressed heavier by the second. "Let her up," he said, still calm. The officer's laugh came too sharp, too high. "You gonna make me?" Phones zeroed in, lenses hungry for the frame that would define the story. The crowd surged again, pressing closer, their shouts layering into a wall of sound. "Let her go! Do it! Listen to him!" Chuck didn't move. His stillness became the movement. The officer's smirk wavered. He was sweating now, drops glinting at the edge of his hairline. For a flicker, he seemed to realize the tide had shifted, that the people around him no longer feared his badge, but measured him against the man standing quietly before him. Yet arrogance clawed its way back. He spat the words out like a dare. "You're just another old fool who doesn't know when to shut up." Chuck's eyes never left his. The pause that followed was long enough for the crowd to still again, leaning inward as though the street itself had narrowed. And then he answered, soft but clear. "Sometimes silence is what convicts you." The officer flinched, almost imperceptibly, but the crowd saw it. A tremor of recognition passed through them. The imbalance, the sudden vulnerability in a man who had strutted moments earlier. Their shouts turned sharper, more insistent. "Release her! Now!" The officer glanced around. For the first time, the badge didn't shield him. The eyes on him were no longer intimidated, they were accusing. And then, almost defiantly, he tightened his grip again. The girl cried out, her voice cracking above the noise. Gasps shot through the crowd. Chuck took a single step forward. The entire street inhaled at once. The sun beat down so hard the asphalt rippled, but all heat seemed to draw toward one spot on the street. The girl's cries had gone thin and sharp, the kind of sound that cut through chatter and left silence behind. Around her the crowd had grown into a restless ring, phones high, voices scattered between anger and hesitation. At the center, the officer knelt heavy, one hand on her arm, the other ready to push back anyone who dared step forward. Chuck was already there. He hadn't moved fast, hadn't needed to. He'd simply walked through the space that opened for him, and in that walk, something about the air changed. People stopped muttering. Even the officer felt it, though he didn't want to admit it. "Your time's over," the officer said, spitting the words with a tight smile. "This isn't Hollywood. This is a real street. You don't belong here." His voice carried, not because it was powerful, but because silence had begun to collect around Chuck. Some in the crowd cheered. Most booed. The noise came in waves, sharp enough to rattle windows. A car horn at the corner blasted, but went unanswered. The officer grinned like he was winning. He leaned forward, sunglasses reflecting nothing but cell phone screens. Chuck didn't blink. His eyes stayed on the man, not the badge, not the crowd, just him. When he finally spoke, the words were so calm that the microphones picked them up more clearly than the shouting. "Let her stand up." The officer laughed. Too loud, too quick. "Or what?" He pressed harder on the girl's wrist. She whimpered and twisted, the sound pulling gasps from the circle. A mother in a summer dress grabbed her son's shoulders, turning him away but not moving herself. Someone shouted, "She's just a kid." Another added, "We're filming this." The officer didn't care. He shoved his free hand toward Chuck, in a sudden lunge meant to humiliate, a push for the cameras. It never touched him. Chuck's hand rose at the exact second it needed to, catching the wrist midline, folding it outward with almost no force. The movement was small but absolute. The officer froze, his arm held in a way that no amount of strength could continue. It wasn't pain, it was the complete denial of momentum. A sound rolled through the crowd, neither cheer nor boo, just breath, caught. For one still moment, they were statues. The officer locked in his aggression, the girl pinned, Chuck standing with balance carved from stone. Then Chuck released. He didn't twist, didn't throw. He let the wrist fall back into the officer's control as if returning borrowed property. The humiliation was sharper than a strike. "I'm not your enemy," Chuck said, still quiet, still steady. "But if you touch that child again, I will be." No one spoke. Even the cicadas in the trees seemed to stop. The words carried heavier than a shout. The girl gasped and held her injured arm against her chest. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a man whispered, "Oh, God," as if he'd just realized where this was heading. The officer's jaw clenched. He straightened, dragging the girl upright with him, because pride wouldn't allow him to let her go. Her face twisted with pain, and the noise of the crowd surged again, chants beginning to form. "Let her go! Let her go!" It was clumsy at first, then steadier, like thunder rolling toward them. Chuck stayed unmoved. He raised two fingers, barely a signal, but the front of the crowd hushed enough for his words to land. "She can't put her hands behind her back," he said. "You hurt her arm?" The girl nodded quickly, tears slipping down her cheeks. That nod was damning. Cameras zoomed, microphones stretched closer. The officer's lips tightened. He felt the walls closing, the crowd, the cameras, the man in front of him who refused to be intimidated. "Last warning," the officer hissed, pulling the girl tighter against his vest. His radio crackled with a voice calling his name, but he ignored it. "Step back." Chuck didn't move. His stillness was more dangerous than any step forward. He breathed once, slow and even, then said, "Look around you." And the officer did, because he had to. Faces stared back, not as a blur, but as individuals. Men with fists half clenched, women clutching children but refusing to leave, dozens of glowing phone screens capturing every twitch of his jaw. Every exit closed, every excuse thinned. His grip faltered. For a moment, his hand loosened on the girl's arm. She exhaled in relief. The crowd caught the change and roared louder, sensing victory. But pride is a dangerous master. The officer's fingers snapped tight again, dragging her back. Phones lifted higher. The chanting shook windows. "Let her go!" The officer's face burned under his glasses. He made his choice. His hand released the girl, not to free her, but to reach for Chuck. This time it wasn't a shove, but a grab, fingers wide and clumsy with anger. Chuck's hand rose to meet it, slow and certain. The street fell silent again. Every eye watched, every camera fixed. The decision of this moment would mark the town forever. The officer yanked his arm back, face hot and blotched with anger. For the first time, he noticed what the crowd already knew. Every phone was pointed at him. 100 little red lights blinked, recording each breath, each twitch of his jaw. His badge no longer made him untouchable. It made him visible. "You all against me?" he shouted, voice breaking. "Without me, this place is chaos." The words hit the street like a stone thrown into water. The crowd reacted as if they were on bleachers at a fight. Boos mixed with cheers, names shouted over whistles. But one name rose higher than the rest, a chant that gathered strength. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The officer's head jerked at the sound, but Chuck didn't move. He simply stood where he was, a quiet figure at the center of a storm. The girl whimpered and tried to shrink back, clutching her arm. The officer lunged again, fingers stabbing into her shoulder. She screamed. The crowd surged, torn between fear and fury, people shouting, parents covering their kids' eyes, a teenager trying to push through. Phones shook in trembling hands as they caught the moment. The whole block had stopped. Shoppers outside the store, a man pumping gas across the street, even cars slowing to watch. Chuck was already there. He stepped in, placing himself between the girl and the officer. No shove, no blow, just presence. His body filled the space, shoulder against the man's chest, eyes steady. The officer's grip met resistance that wasn't violent, but immovable. The girl ducked behind him, her sobs muffled in the fabric of his shirt. The street exploded with sound. Applause, shouts of approval, others crying out warnings. In that instant, Chuck wasn't a celebrity. He was a shield, and everyone could see it. "Back off, old man," the officer barked, trying to recover, trying to shake off the humiliation of being stopped. He jabbed a finger into Chuck's chest, fast and hard. The crowd gasped. Chuck didn't flinch. The jab landed like a drop of rain against stone. The officer tried again, harder, angling for the girl. Chuck's arm rose and brushed him aside, not striking, just erasing the path. It looked simple, but it carried weight, the kind of gesture that said you're finished here. Voices rang from the edges. "We saw you grab her." "We're witnesses." People shouted their own names into the chaos, as if to stamp themselves into the record. The officer's jaw twitched. He could feel the ground tilting under him, power draining away with every cry. Chuck's voice cut through, quiet but sharp. "Stop," he said. "One more step and you can't take it back." The officer's nostrils flared. He ripped his sleeve free and stepped back, chest heaving. Rage made him theatrical. He spread his arms as if to embrace the whole crowd. "You think he's saving order? You're tearing it down. Without me, this town burns." The chant answered him, "Chuck! Chuck!" and it rattled him worse than booze. He snapped, "Shut up!" into the noise, and that admission fed the chant more. A bottle rolled out from somewhere, clinking harmlessly across asphalt. The officer's head snapped toward the sound. The crowd tensed, braced for escalation. He chose badly. Habit dragged him again toward the girl, reaching around Chuck's shoulder. Chuck moved quicker, redirecting his arm, body angling to block. No strike, no harm, just geometry that closed the door. The officer's hand clutched air. The crowd reacted like a wave changing direction. Less roar, more rumble, a shift in tone. Someone shouted, "You're done!" And it didn't sound like a taunt, more like a sentence passed. Humiliation deepened into desperation. The officer's hand darted to his belt. A metallic snap echoed as he pulled his baton free and flicked it open. The glossy rod extended with a sound that drew the air out of the crowd. Screams of "Put it down!" clashed with raw panic. Parents dragged kids back. Others raised phones higher. The heat of the day pressed closer, thick with fear. Chuck didn't retreat. He stepped forward half a pace, feet planted. He didn't raise fists like a fighter. His stance looked like someone ready to catch something falling. The girl pressed into his back, breath quick, eyes locked on the weapon. The officer lifted the baton just enough to show intent. His voice cracked from strain. "I will not be threatened on my own street." "This isn't your street," someone shouted. Dozens repeated it until it became a chant. "Not your street! Not your street!" The baton hovered. The girl cried softly. The crowd leaned forward, cameras flashing, neon buzzing above. Time pulled thin. The officer's breath rasped. Chuck's eyes didn't leave his. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His stillness spoke louder than rage. And the street, no longer a street at all, had become an arena. Everyone felt it. The next move would decide everything. The metallic click of the baton unfolding snapped through the heavy Texas air like a bone breaking. The sound was too sharp, too clean, and it cut the street into silence for a fraction of a second before the noise of the crowd swelled back, louder, more desperate. Parents pulled children closer. Teenagers shoved their phones higher into the air, and someone shouted, voice cracking, "Put it down! She's just a kid." The officer didn't lower his arm. His face was red, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the girl and the sea of cameras. Sweat streaked through the dust on his temples. He raised the baton higher, the posture not of control, but of a cornered man lashing out. "I am the law here," he barked, but the words wobbled, swallowed by 100 voices chanting back. "Drop it! Drop it!" Behind him the girl whimpered, her injured wrist cradled to her chest. Her small frame shook with every breath, and in front of her, steady as stone, stood Chuck. He didn't move fast, didn't shout. He stepped once into the space between threat and victim, grounding himself like a man planting a fence post. His hands rose, not closed fists, but open, palms ready. When the officer swung, Chuck caught the forearm just before impact. His other hand clamped the wrist, not violently, but with the kind of inevitability that made the baton stop mid-arc, suspended in failure. The street fell silent again. Even the cicadas in the trees seemed to hush, leaving only the sound of the girl's broken breathing and the faint hum of electricity from a streetlight. The officer strained, face twisting as he tried to finish what he had started, but Chuck didn't tighten or wrench. He simply occupied the space, redirecting the strike into nothing. From the front row of the crowd, a boy whispered, "He stopped it," as if reporting on gravity. His mother pressed his shoulder, eyes fixed on the hold. Chuck's voice came low, controlled, and every ear strained to catch it. "You confuse strength with violence, and that is your defeat." The officer tried again, jerking against the grip, but Chuck turned his wrist just enough that the baton dipped toward the asphalt. The motion looked effortless, but it stole all authority from the weapon. The rod wavered, hung, then tapped against the ground with a hollow, humiliating sound. "Drop it!" Voices roared, no longer chaotic but unified, like a verdict. "Drop it now!" The girl sobbed, but her tears had shifted. Not panic anymore. Release. For the first time she leaned into safety, into the wall of Chuck's back shielding her. He didn't look at her, but his presence told her he knew she was there. "Look at her," Chuck said, words quiet but sharp. The officer resisted, but his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the girl. She stood trembling, wrist swollen, cheeks streaked with dirt and salt. "You did that!" The sentence landed like a stone dropped in a well. The crowd recoiled in a sound that wasn't quite language, more like shame given shape. A man near the curb removed his hat, holding it over his chest. The officer's arm sagged, baton sliding halfway toward the pavement. For one dangerous second it seemed over. His lips parted, an apology almost formed. But the weight of the lenses, the certainty that this moment would live forever online, dragged his pride back from the edge. His grip hardened. "Put it down," Chuck repeated, eyes locked. "This is the last clean moment you'll get." The officer's mouth twitched. His sunglasses had slipped low, showing the red lines of exhaustion and fury in his eyes. The radio on his shoulder crackled. His name, followed by a question. He didn't answer. The silence of his refusal was louder than any response. He pulled again, desperate, and Chuck let him, guiding the motion down so the baton scraped the asphalt. Then, with deliberate calm, he released the wrist. The weapon hung, useless, suddenly just dead weight. The crowd exhaled, shoulders loosening. For a heartbeat, it felt like the town might step back from the edge. Someone even cheered weakly, though the sound faltered. Nobody trusted the peace. Then the radio hissed louder. His name again, this time urgent, and pride, bruised, humiliated, latched onto the voice like a rope. He grabbed the radio with his free hand, thumb hovering over the button. "No?" someone whispered from the crowd. Too late. The officer pressed down. "Unit needs assistance." The words carried through the speakers of every recording phone, bouncing off brick and glass. They didn't ignite the crowd, they chilled it. People looked to the horizon, to the corners of the street. Far off, the faint cough of a siren answered. The girl pressed closer to Chuck, hiding behind the only steady figure left. Chuck closed his eyes once, opened them, and stood unmoving as the crowd braced for the storm rolling toward them. The sirens rolled in like a storm, faint at first, then swelling until they swallowed every sound on the street. Red and blue lights washed across storefront glass, turning the small-town street into something unreal, like a film set. The crowd shifted uneasily, people pulling their children closer, phones still raised, but hands trembling. The air smelled of hot asphalt, sweat, and fear. 4 cruisers screeched to a stop. Doors flew open. Boots hit the pavement in quick succession, the kind of rhythm drilled in training but now echoing like a warning. Officers stepped out in a line, some gripping batons, others with fingers too near their holsters. Radios spat static and clipped codes. To the people watching, it felt less like police arriving and more like reinforcements in a war. The disgraced officer stood pale and sweating, his chest heaving. His baton lay on the ground, abandoned. His voice cracked as he pointed at Chuck. "He assaulted me!" "Arrest him!" Nobody believed it. The words fell flat, drowned by the sound of dozens of phones recording, by the mutter of a crowd that had seen too much. The sergeant, older, slower, scanned the scene with narrowed eyes. He saw the girl clutching her arm, the medics pushing through the mass, the people shouting for justice. And in the center, Chuck, still as a statue, the girl sheltered behind him. The sergeant's voice carried more weight than volume when he spoke. "Who's hurt?" Chuck answered, calm but unyielding. "She is. She needs a medic." The girl lifted her hand slightly, her face streaked with tears. The sergeant nodded once. "Get her treated." The medics hurried forward, wrapped her arm, spoke gently. The crowd softened for a moment, parting just enough to let them through, then closed tight again. The officer who started it all couldn't let go. He lunged, grabbing at a medic's shoulder. The crowd erupted in shouts. Phones shook in trembling hands. But before he could do more, Chuck moved, swift, controlled. He caught the man's wrist in midair, not hurting him, just stopping him cold. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouts. Chuck leaned in, voice low but clear enough for every microphone. "You confuse violence with strength. That's your weakness." The man yanked free, but his authority had collapsed. He stood panting, eyes darting everywhere but at Chuck. The crowd roared, some cheering, some jeering, all swept into the storm. Then new cruisers turned the corner. More officers spilled out, forming a line. A loudspeaker crackled. "This is your final warning. Disperse immediately or face arrest." Panic rippled through the people. Some tried to leave, others shouted back, unwilling to move. A barricade crashed to the ground with a metallic scream. The chants fractured into chaos. Through it all, Chuck didn't move. His shoulders square, his expression carved from stone. He stood between the girl and the wave of uniforms. She looked back once as the medics guided her toward the ambulance. Chuck gave her a single nod. She nodded back through her tears. The doors closed, and she was gone. The tension tightened like a rope about to snap. Officers adjusted grips, some on batons, some on guns. The crowd surged forward, then back, a tide without direction. The air buzzed with sirens and shouted orders. Chuck finally raised his voice, steady but sharp. "If you stand for the law, protect her." The words landed harder than any punch. The sergeant's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on Chuck. Behind him, rookies shifted nervously, uncertain whether to follow training or conscience. And then the barricade tipped again. Someone shoved. A scream split the night. Red and blue lights spun faster, blinding. In the chaos, Chuck remained immovable, a calm figure at the eye of the storm, as if daring the world to decide what came next. That was the last image before the footage cut off. Sirens screaming, the crowd on the edge of collapse, and Chuck standing firm. His presence, both a shield and a question no one yet had the courage to answer.